The key turned in the lock from the outside, and Eleanor Whitmore heard her own door seal her inside like a piece of furniture nobody wanted moved. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, not to push it open, for she knew better than that by now, but simply to feel the small vibration of the bolt settling into place. Somewhere below her, in the hall, her stepmother's voice rang out crisp and satisfied. "That will keep her quiet until we return." Eleanor did not cry. She had trained herself out of that particular weakness 2 years ago, on the night her father's coffin had been lowered into the cold ground and Margaret Whitmore had turned to her, still in mourning black, and said that the house rules would now be different. Eleanor had believed, foolishly, that grief might soften a woman like Margaret. It had not. If anything, grief had given Margaret a kind of freedom, because there was no longer anyone left in the house to question her. She walked to the window instead, since the window at least was hers to look through, even if it was not hers to open more than a crack. Below, in the gravel drive, the carriage was being loaded. She watched her stepsisters, Louisa and Charlotte, climb in wearing gowns that had once belonged, in fabric and thread, to a portion of her own inheritance. Margaret followed them, moving with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once been told no and meant to keep it that way. The carriage pulled away toward the Barrowmere estate, toward the ball that half the county had spoken of for a month, and Eleanor watched it go until the wheels vanished behind the hedge line and the sound of hooves faded into ordinary silence. She did not blame herself for wanting to go. That was the strange thing about locked doors. They did not kill wanting. They only proved how much of it a person could carry while getting nothing. Her room had been her father's study once. She could still find, if she looked closely enough at the skirting board near the fireplace, the small groove where his writing desk had stood for 20 years before Margaret had it removed and replaced with a narrow bed and washstand, declaring that Eleanor no longer needed a room of her own size now that she contributed nothing to the household. Eleanor had never been permitted to ask what, exactly, she was meant to contribute, given that she was not permitted to leave the grounds without an escort, not permitted callers, not permitted so much as a letter that Margaret did not read first. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for 1 full minute, to imagine what the ballroom looked like tonight. She had heard the villagers speak of the Barrowmere house with a kind of reverent exaggeration, tall windows glowing gold from within, musicians brought in from the city, a duke returned from abroad who was said to be as unreadable as a locked ledger. She let the picture form and then, deliberately, she let it go, because there was no version of tonight that included her, and dwelling on a door that would not open only wasted the strength she needed for tomorrow. A soft knock interrupted her, 3 careful taps low on the door, the kind that would not carry to the stairs. "Miss Eleanor," came a familiar whisper. "It's only me." Eleanor moved to the door. "Agnes, you should not be caught near this door tonight, of all nights." "I am not caught," Agnes said, and there was the faint scrape of something sliding beneath the gap at the bottom of the door, "because I am very good at not being caught, which is more than I can say for the mistress's temper." Eleanor knelt and found a folded scrap of paper on the floorboards, along with something small and metal beside it. She picked up the metal piece first and recognized it instantly. A narrow iron key, old and slightly bent at the shaft, the kind used on the servants' passage doors rather than the main house locks. "Agnes, what is this?" "That door was fitted with a servant's lock 40 years ago, before your father changed the fittings on the main rooms," Agnes said through the wood. "This one was never swapped out on the inside mechanism, only the outer plate. I have known it since I was a girl scrubbing these same floors. It will not work from where you are standing, not on that lock, but it will work on the passage door at the end of the hall, the one behind the linen press that nobody has opened in years." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the key. "You could lose your position for this." "I could," Agnes agreed simply, "but I watched your father raise you to have a spine, Miss Eleanor, and it would shame his memory more if I let that spine rust shut in this room, while the woman who buried him half a year late in her own grief pretends she is the injured party." Eleanor almost smiled. It had been a long time since anyone spoke to her as though she were still a person capable of decisions, rather than a burden to be managed. She unfolded the scrap of paper. In Agnes's careful, uneven hand, it read, "The blue trunk in the attic holds your mother's gowns. They were never sold because the mistress does not know they exist. Be quick, and be careful, and do not let anyone see you leave by the east gate." For a long moment, Eleanor simply held the paper, feeling something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not hope exactly. Hope had proven too dangerous a thing to trust, but something adjacent to it, something with teeth. "Agnes," she said quietly, "why now? You have never done anything like this before." There was a pause on the other side of the door, and when Agnes spoke again, her voice had lost its brisk practicality and gone soft with something older. "Because I served your mother before I ever served this house, and I made her a promise the winter before she died, that I would not let her daughter disappear into these walls the way some women do. I have watched you disappear a little more every season, Miss Eleanor, and I decided tonight that I would rather lose my place than watch it happen for one more year." Eleanor pressed the key against her palm until the metal warmed. "Then I suppose I had better not waste your promise." She moved quickly after that, the fear of hesitation outweighing the fear of discovery. She found the passage door behind the linen press exactly where Agnes had said, hidden under a decade of dust and forgotten linens, and the old iron key turned with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the emptied house, though no one remained to hear it but Agnes, who stood watch at the top of the servants' stair with a candle shielded in her hand. The attic smelled of cedar and dust and something faintly like lavender, a scent Eleanor associated so completely with her mother that for a moment she simply stood still, breathing it in, before she found the blue trunk pushed into the far corner beneath a broken rocking chair. Inside, folded with the kind of care that only comes from someone who once loved the person who wore them, were 3 gowns, silk gone slightly dull with age but otherwise untouched. She chose the deep green one, not because it was the finest, but because it was the one that still held, faintly, the shape of her mother's shoulders, and wearing it felt less like theft, and more like being handed something back. Agnes helped her dress in the narrow attic light, working quickly, pinning where the years had loosened the seams, tucking a stray curl of Eleanor's dark hair back into place with a hairpin that had also once belonged to her mother. "You cannot arrive in the family carriage," Agnes murmured, working a final pin into place. "Old Simon the gardener has agreed to take the cart as far as the crossroads, no further. He cannot risk more than that, and you will have to walk the rest in those slippers, which is not ideal, but it is what we have." "It is more than I had an hour ago," Eleanor said. At the east gate, in the deepening blue of early evening, Eleanor paused with one hand on the cold iron latch and looked back once at the house that had, for 2 years, felt less like a home and more like a very patient trap. She thought of Margaret's voice through the door, of the bolt sliding home, of 100 small cruelties, dressed up as household order. Then she opened the gate and stepped through it, and did not look back again. The cart ride was cold and cramped, and old Simon said almost nothing the entire way except, near the end, to warn her that if anyone from the house asked, he had seen nothing and driven no one anywhere that evening. Eleanor thanked him with more sincerity than the short journey seemed to warrant, and climbed down at the crossroads where the road split toward the Barrowmere estate, its long avenue of lit lanterns visible even from this distance, glowing like a string of small captured stars. She began to walk. The slippers were not made for gravel roads, and by the time the gates of Barrowmere came into view, her feet ached and her borrowed hem was dusted pale at the edges, but none of that mattered when she finally stood at the base of the drive and looked up at the house itself. It was, without exaggeration, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Every window burned gold. Carriages lined the drive in a long, glittering row, footmen moving between them with practiced ease, and somewhere inside, faint and rich, she could hear the opening notes of a quartet beginning to play. For one final moment, standing at the edge of all that light with her mother's gown around her shoulders and her stepmother's threats behind her, Eleanor Whitmore allowed herself to be afraid. And then, because fear had never once opened a door for her, she straightened her spine the way her father had taught her to as a girl, and walked forward into the light. She had no invitation, no escort, and no plan beyond this single step. Only a stolen key, a borrowed gown, and a promise made by a woman who had loved her mother enough to risk everything for her daughter. It would have to be enough. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she was standing outside a wall instead of within one, and the feeling was so unfamiliar that her hands trembled slightly as she reached the base of the steps. She pressed them flat against the green silk of her skirt and made herself breathe slowly, the way her father used to tell her to breathe before difficult conversations. A footman near the entrance glanced her way, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten, certain for one terrible instant that he would ask for her name, her family, the invitation she did not carry. But the crowd arriving that evening was large and fashionable, and moving in loose clusters rather than an orderly line, and the footman's attention shifted almost immediately to a carriage pulling up behind her, its occupants calling out greetings to someone already inside. She used the distraction without shame. She had learned, in 2 years of locked doors, that opportunities rarely announced themselves twice. Inside, the entrance hall alone was larger than the whole of the ground floor at home, its ceiling painted with pale clouds and gilded edges, its floor a checkered marble that caught the candlelight and threw it back twice as bright. Eleanor kept close to the edges of the crowd, the way she had once kept close to walls as a child playing hide games in the garden, watching everything, revealing as little of herself as possible. The music grew louder as she moved deeper into the house, until she reached the entrance to the ballroom itself and stopped, quite involuntarily, at the threshold. She had imagined gold light from the outside, but she had not imagined this. An entire room built of it, chandeliers hanging like small suns, gowns in every shade turning and gliding across the floor in patterns she recognized from her mother's old dancing lessons, half remembered from childhood and never once practiced since. The air smelled of beeswax candles and crushed flowers, and something warm beneath it all, the particular scent of a house full of people who had never once known what it felt like to be locked inside a room of their own. Eleanor stood at the edge of that light, unnoticed, unannounced, and utterly out of place, and told herself that being out of place was, tonight, infinitely better than being shut away. She had no way of knowing, standing there with her borrowed gown and her stolen hour of freedom, that across the room a tall, quiet man in dark evening clothes had already noticed the stranger standing alone at the threshold, watching the dancers with an expression that was not envy and not longing, but something far more interesting to a man who had spent the whole evening being bored by everyone else in the room. A hand closed gently around Eleanor's elbow before she had taken 3 steps into the ballroom, and her whole body went rigid, certain in that first heartbeat that she had already been caught. "Forgive me," said a low voice beside her, "but you looked as though you were about to be trampled by that group of dancers, and I could not in good conscience watch it happen." Eleanor turned and found herself looking up into a face she did not recognize, though something in his bearing told her instantly that she should have. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in evening black without a single ornament to mark his rank, which in a room full of men competing to be noticed, made him somehow the most noticeable person present. His eyes were a pale gray, watchful in a way that made her feel, absurdly, as though he had already read half her secrets before she had spoken a single word. "I was not in danger of being trampled," she said, recovering her composure. "I was simply standing still, which I understand is a great crime in a room built entirely for movement." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Eleanor felt encouraged rather than embarrassed. "A fair defense," he said. "Though I would argue that standing still in the middle of a doorway during a country dance is its own kind of danger. May I steer you somewhere less likely to result in injury?" "You may," Eleanor said, "though I should warn you that I know none of the dances well enough to trust myself among that crowd." "Then we are evenly matched," the stranger said, guiding her gently toward the edge of the room, away from the swirling gowns and the sharp elbows of dancers who had clearly practiced these steps since childhood, "because I have spent the better part of this evening avoiding the dance floor entirely, and I am the host." Eleanor stopped walking. "You are the Duke of Barrowmere." "I am," he said, and there was something careful in the way he watched her react, as though he had learned over many seasons to brace himself for the change that came over people's faces the instant his title was spoken. "Alexander Barrowmere, and you have the advantage of me, because I do not believe we have been introduced." For one dangerous, dizzying second, Eleanor considered lying, inventing a name and a family that would explain her presence without raising questions. But something about the plain honesty in his manner made the lie feel cheap before she had even spoken it, and so she chose, instead, the truth, or at least the part of it she could safely give. "Eleanor," she said simply, "Eleanor Whitmore." If the name meant anything to him, he did not show it, and she was grateful, because the Whitmore name in most rooms these days belonged more to Margaret's reputation than to her father's memory, and she had no wish to begin this conversation defending either. "Miss Whitmore," Alexander said, inclining his head slightly. "You arrived late. I would have noticed you earlier." "I had some difficulty with the roads," she said, which was not, strictly speaking, a lie. "The roads have been troublesome for half the county tonight, apparently," he said, and there was a dry note in his voice that told her he had heard several equally vague excuses already that evening, and found most of them tiresome, though I confess you are the first guest to arrive looking as though the road itself had personally inconvenienced her slippers. Eleanor glanced down at her dusted hem and felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I did walk a portion of the way." "Did you?" Alexander said, and there was genuine curiosity in it now, not mockery. "And here, I assume the Whitmore estate was close enough to arrive comfortably by carriage." "It is," Eleanor said carefully, "when a carriage is available." She watched him note the careful phrasing, watched something in his expression sharpen slightly, though he did not press further, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. Instead, he guided her toward a quieter alcove near one of the tall windows, away from the worst of the noise, where a small table held 2 untouched glasses of punch that a passing footman had clearly abandoned mid-delivery. "You do not dance, and you did not arrive by carriage, and you knew my title before I gave my name, which tells me you are not entirely unfamiliar with this house," Alexander said, handing her one of the glasses. "And yet I have never once seen you before tonight, in a county where I flatter myself I know most families by sight, if not by close acquaintance." "Perhaps I simply do not attend many balls," Eleanor said. "Perhaps," he agreed, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe it. "Or perhaps you have very good reasons for staying away from them that have nothing to do with your own preference." Eleanor looked at him sharply, startled by how close the observation landed to the truth, but his expression held no cruelty in it, only a kind of quiet attentiveness that felt entirely unlike the careless curiosity of most people she had met in society. She had the sudden, disorienting sense that this man was not simply making conversation to pass an evening he found dull, but was actually listening, weighing her words the way a person weighs something valuable rather than something merely decorative. "You are very direct for a duke," she said, partly to change the subject and partly because it was true. "I have found directness saves a great deal of time," Alexander said. "Most conversations at events like this one are built entirely of things people do not mean," said very beautifully. "I have grown tired of decoding beautiful things that mean nothing. And what do I mean then?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her own boldness, "since you seem so determined to read past what I say." Alexander considered her for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had lost its dry humor and gone quieter, more careful. "I think you arrived here tonight against considerable difficulty, Miss Whitmore, and I think you are far more frightened of being discovered than you are willing to admit, and I think, whatever brought you to my ballroom in a walking dress dusted with road gravel, it took a great deal of courage to cross that threshold." Eleanor's breath caught. For one long moment she said nothing at all, because she did not trust her voice not to betray exactly how close he had come to the truth, and admitting it, here, to a stranger, however kind his eyes, felt like handing over a weapon to someone whose intentions she could not yet judge. "You assume a great deal from a dusty hem," she said finally, forcing lightness back into her tone. "I assume nothing," Alexander said. "I only observe. It is, I am told, an unfortunate habit of mine, one that makes me poor company at events specifically designed for pleasant nonsense." "Then it is fortunate," Eleanor said, "that I have never much cared for pleasant nonsense either." Something shifted between them then, subtle but unmistakable, the particular ease that comes when two people who have both grown weary of performing for a room discover, quite by accident, that they no longer have to perform for each other. They spoke for a long while after that, though Eleanor would later struggle to recall the exact order of the conversation, only the shape of it, questions about books he assumed she would not have read and had, opinions about the tediousness of certain popular composers, a shared, quiet laugh at the expense of a gentleman across the room who had been attempting the same overly complicated dance step for the better part of 20 minutes without once succeeding. She learned, in fragments, that Alexander had returned to Barrowmere only the previous year, following a long absence abroad that he did not explain and she did not ask him to. She learned that he found most of society's expectations of him exhausting, that he had inherited the title earlier than he expected, under circumstances he clearly did not wish to discuss, and that he had thrown tonight's ball more out of obligation to his mother's memory than any real desire for company. In turn, she gave him small true things, carefully chosen, enough honesty to keep the conversation feeling real without handing him the full shape of her situation. She told him she loved gardens more than ballrooms, that she had once known how to ride before circumstances made it impossible, that she missed her father more than she had words for. At one point, Alexander asked her, quite plainly, what she would do with an evening if no one at all were watching her, and Eleanor found the question strange enough that she laughed before she answered it. "No one is ever watching," she said. "I would simply be permitted to enjoy myself without wondering what it might cost me tomorrow." "That sounds less like an answer, and more like a complaint," Alexander said, though not unkindly. "Perhaps it is both," Eleanor admitted. "I have not been asked what I would do with a free evening in a very long time. I am somewhat out of practice imagining one." "Then imagine it now," he said. "Indulge me. If this ballroom were empty of every soul but the two of us, and no consequence waited for you outside those doors, what would you do first?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, turning her glass slowly in her hands. "I think I would ask the musicians to play something slower," something with no steps I was expected to already know, and I would simply move however felt right, badly, probably, and not care in the slightest who was watching, because no one would be. A modest ambition, Alexander said, and yet I suspect it is a rarer one in this room than you realize. Most people here would ask for jewels, or introductions, or a better seat at supper. Perhaps I have learned to want smaller things, Eleanor said. Smaller things are harder to take away. Alexander went quiet at that, and when he spoke again his voice had softened further, losing the last of its dry, performing edge entirely. That is a very careful way to live, Miss Whitmore. I do not think it is meant as a compliment to whoever taught you to live that way. Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say, and instead turned the conversation gently elsewhere, asking him about the portraits lining the long gallery she had glimpsed on her way into the ballroom, whether the stern-faced woman near the entrance truly was his grandmother, as the guests near the door had whispered, and whether it was true that Barrowmere kept a library larger than the village church. He answered readily, clearly relieved to speak of something that did not require either of them to look too closely at the things left unsaid, and for a while the conversation moved easily between books and gardens and the small, safe absurdities of people they both knew only by reputation. Eleanor found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply enjoying a conversation rather than managing it, and she noticed, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that Alexander seemed to be doing precisely the same thing. It was during a lull in that conversation, while the musicians paused to retune, that Eleanor caught sight of two familiar faces across the room, and felt every ounce of warmth drain instantly from her chest. Louisa and Charlotte stood near the refreshment table, and Louisa's eyes had already found her, wide with disbelief, already narrowing with the particular calculation Eleanor knew far too well from a lifetime spent beneath the same roof. Alexander, watching her face change, followed her gaze without comment, though she saw him note the direction of it, saw something in his posture straighten almost imperceptibly, the quiet, careful attention of a man who had just noticed a storm gathering on his own horizon, and had decided, without yet saying so, that he did not intend to let it simply happen to the woman standing beside him. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, not looking away from the two women across the room, "I believe you are about to have a difficult moment. Would you prefer I remain beside you through it, or step away?" Eleanor's hands tightened around the stem of her glass. Louisa had already begun moving through the crowd toward them, her expression sharpening with every step, and somewhere behind her, unmistakable even at this distance, came the particular set of shoulders that belonged only to Margaret Whitmore. "Stay," Eleanor said, before she could think better of it, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Please stay." Alexander did not move away. He shifted, instead, almost imperceptibly, so that he stood a half-step nearer to her, not enough to draw attention, but enough that Eleanor felt the quiet weight of it, the deliberate choice of a man deciding, in real time, whose side he intended to take before the storm even arrived. Louisa was closing the distance quickly now, her fan snapping shut in her gloved hand, and behind her, Margaret's pace had slowed, not from hesitation, Eleanor knew, but from the particular patience of a woman who preferred to let her daughters do the first unpleasant work, before arriving to deliver the final blow herself. Eleanor set her glass down carefully on the small table, aware suddenly of how loudly her own heartbeat sounded in her ears, and straightened her spine the way her father had taught her, the way she had promised herself she would, whatever came next. "Whatever is said in the next few minutes," she murmured, mostly to herself, "I did not imagine this evening. I did not imagine any of it." "No," Alexander said quietly, watching Louisa approach with an expression that had gone entirely unreadable, the pleasant curiosity of earlier folded away behind something far more composed. "You did not. And I intend to make certain that whatever your stepmother believes she is walking toward, she finds something rather different waiting for her instead." Louisa reached them first, her smile fixed too tightly at the corners to be anything but a warning. "Eleanor," she said, pitching her voice just loud enough to draw the attention of the nearest cluster of guests, "how extraordinary to find you here. I confess I did not see your name among tonight's invitations." "That is because there was none," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself, meeting Louisa's gaze without flinching. She had spent 2 years flinching in that house, and something about standing beside Alexander Barrowmere made her suddenly unwilling to continue the habit. A ripple of interest moved through the guests standing nearest them, the particular hush of people pretending not to listen, while listening very closely indeed. Louisa's smile faltered for half a second before she caught it and rebuilt it, though her eyes had gone hard. "How resourceful of you then," Louisa said, "to arrive somewhere you were not invited. Mother will want to hear all about it. I am certain she will, Eleanor said. Margaret arrived a moment later, moving through the parting crowd with the unhurried confidence Eleanor had watched her use 100 times before, the confidence of a woman who had never once had to consider that a room might not simply reorganize itself around her wishes. But whatever speech Margaret had prepared on her approach seemed to falter the instant she registered exactly who was standing beside her stepdaughter, and Eleanor watched, with something close to fascination, the visible effort it took Margaret to smooth her expression back into something appropriately composed. "Your Grace," Margaret said, dropping into a curtsy so deep it bordered on theatrical, "forgive the disturbance. My stepdaughter has clearly wandered from home without proper supervision, and I am mortified she has troubled you." "She has not troubled me in the slightest," Alexander said, his tone pleasant and entirely unhurried. "I invited Miss Whitmore to remain by my side for the evening. I find her conversation considerably more interesting than most of what I have endured tonight." Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly, just long enough for Eleanor to see it. "Your Grace is very generous, but I am afraid there has been some misunderstanding. Eleanor is not well. She suffers from spells, nervous spells, and it would be safer for everyone if she returned home immediately, before she says something regrettable." "Nervous spells," Alexander repeated, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "How curious. In the better part of an hour speaking with her, I found Miss Whitmore to be the single most clear-headed person I have met all evening. Perhaps you and I have encountered different women." A quiet murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, and Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly. The particular relief of watching a lie she had been forced to live inside collapse in public for the first time. Margaret's eyes flicked toward Eleanor with something sharp and dangerous, a warning Eleanor had learned to recognize since childhood, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, that warning did not land the way it once had. Standing here, in this light, beside a man who had just publicly, calmly, contradicted her stepmother in front of half the county, Eleanor felt something in herself straighten that had been bent low for 2 long years. "Perhaps," Margaret said carefully, recalibrating, "Your Grace is simply unfamiliar with the family's circumstances. Eleanor's father passed some time ago, and the estate has proven a considerable burden. It falls to me to manage matters that Eleanor, in her grief, has never quite been equipped to handle." "And yet," Alexander said, "she arrived here tonight, alone, on foot for a portion of the journey, by her own account, in a gown that once belonged, I would guess, to her mother, rather than purchased new for the season. That does not strike me as the behavior of a woman incapable of managing her own affairs. It strikes me as the behavior of a woman who has been given very little choice in the matter." The words landed in the small circle of listeners, like a stone dropped into still water, and Eleanor watched color rise sharply in Margaret's face, the practiced composure finally beginning to slip in earnest. Louisa shot her mother a look of pure alarm, clearly recalculating the evening's plan in real time, while Charlotte, who had arrived only a moment before and said nothing at all, simply stared between Eleanor and the Duke with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice dropping lower, more urgent now, "I would not wish to trouble you with family matters best discussed elsewhere. Eleanor, come, we are leaving." Eleanor did not move. For the first time in 2 years, standing in a stranger's ballroom with her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the music, she found the word rising in her throat with none of the fear it usually carried. "No," she said. The single word seemed to echo far louder than its size warranted. Margaret's expression flickered through several emotions in rapid succession, disbelief chief among them, as though the very concept of Eleanor refusing her, aloud, in front of witnesses, had never once occurred to her as a possibility. "Eleanor," Margaret said, low and dangerous now, the pleasant mask slipping entirely, "you will not embarrass this family further. Come with me now." "I think," Alexander said quietly, stepping half a pace forward so that he stood, deliberately, between Eleanor and her stepmother, "that Miss Whitmore has made her wishes reasonably clear. She would like to remain. As this is my house, and she is my guest, I intend to honor that wish." The finality in his voice left no room for argument, and Margaret seemed to understand this even as fury visibly worked behind her eyes. She could not here, not in front of half the county's most influential families, continue to press the matter without revealing far more about the household's true workings than she had ever intended anyone to see. "Of course," Margaret said finally, forcing the words out through a smile gone brittle at the edges. "Whatever your Grace prefers, Eleanor. We will discuss this further at home." The threat in those final words was not lost on Eleanor, who felt a familiar coldness settle beneath her ribs even as the immediate danger passed. She knew Margaret well enough to understand that public humiliation, however satisfying to witness, rarely went unanswered in private, and that whatever waited for her back at the house tonight would likely be far worse for the fact that it had been delayed. But that was a problem for later. For now, Margaret turned, gathering her daughters with a sharp glance, and withdrew from the small circle of onlookers with as much dignity as she could salvage, leaving Eleanor standing beside Alexander in a ballroom suddenly, uncomfortably full of curious eyes. "That was not wise of me," Eleanor said quietly, once the immediate crowd had begun to disperse and return to their own conversations, the momentary scandal already being folded into the evening's gossip. "You do not know what she is capable of, Your Grace. And now you have made an enemy of her in front of everyone who matters in this county." "I have made worse enemies for smaller reasons," Alexander said, and there was something steady and unbothered in the way he said it that Eleanor found she believed completely. "And please, call me Alexander. I find titles exhausting from people I actually wish to know." Eleanor allowed herself, finally, a small tired laugh. "Alexander then. Though I warn you, my situation is considerably more complicated than one uncomfortable conversation at a ball can solve." "I did not imagine it would be solved tonight," he said, "but I have found that most complicated situations begin to unravel once someone finally refuses to pretend they are simple. You did that tonight, in front of a great many witnesses who will not soon forget it." "That is not nothing, Eleanor." She turned his use of her given name over in her mind, surprised by how naturally it settled between them, as though they had known each other far longer than a single evening warranted. "What happens now?" she asked, and the question carried more weight than the simple words suggested. A question not just about the remainder of the evening, but about everything waiting for her once the carriage rolled her back through the gates of the only home she had left. Alexander considered the question seriously, his gray eyes moving briefly toward the doors through which Margaret and her daughters had just departed, before returning to Eleanor's face. "Tonight, you will finish this evening as my guest, properly, with supper, and whatever remains of the dancing you claim not to know, though I suspect you know a great deal more than you let on. Tomorrow, or whenever you feel it wise, I intend to call at the Whitmore house and speak with your stepmother directly, as a neighbor concerned for a family under his protection now, in however small a fashion." "You do not owe me protection," Eleanor said. "We met an hour ago." "An hour is sometimes enough," Alexander said simply, "to recognize when someone has been quietly surviving something that should never have been asked of them in the first place. I do not know the full shape of your circumstances yet, Eleanor, but I know enough to understand that tonight was not the act of a woman with many good choices left to her. That troubles me. I do not intend to simply forget it once the music ends." Something in his steady certainty settled the frantic edge that had been humming beneath Eleanor's ribs since the moment Louisa's eyes had first found her across the crowded room. She did not know, could not possibly know yet, what this strange, direct man truly intended by his words, whether kindness of this magnitude from a stranger could be trusted at all after 2 years of learning that trust was usually a door someone else held the key to. But for tonight, in this gilded room full of gold light and unfamiliar music, she allowed herself to simply exist without calculating the cost of it. Supper was announced not long after, and Alexander offered his arm without ceremony, as though escorting her to the long, candle-lit table were the most natural thing in the world, rather than a gesture that would set half the room's tongues moving before the soup had even been served. Eleanor felt the weight of curious glances as they crossed the room together, felt them settle on her borrowed gown, her unfamiliar face, the space beside the Duke that no one had expected to be filled tonight. She kept her chin level and her steps steady, reminding herself that whatever whispers followed her home would matter far less than the fact that, for one evening, she had been permitted to sit at a table as herself, rather than as someone's inconvenience. The seat beside Alexander had clearly been intended for someone else, judging by the brief flicker of surprise on the face of an older woman further down the table, but no one moved to correct the arrangement, and Alexander made no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred at all. Conversation around them moved in the ordinary currents of any large gathering, weather and horses and the merits of this season's fashions, and Eleanor found herself, for long stretches, simply listening, content to exist quietly within the warmth of it rather than perform for anyone's benefit. A gentleman across the table, emboldened by wine, asked Eleanor directly which family she belonged to, and she felt the old, practiced tightness return to her shoulders before Alexander answered smoothly on her behalf, redirecting the conversation toward the composer whose music the quartet had played earlier, a subject he clearly knew intimately, and discussed with such genuine enthusiasm that the table's attention shifted gratefully away from Eleanor entirely. She caught his eye once during the exchange and found him watching her with the faintest trace of a private smile, as though the rescue had been deliberate and he rather enjoyed how neatly it had worked. When the dancing resumed after supper, Alexander led her onto the floor despite her protests that she knew nothing beyond the most basic steps, and true to his word, he proved a patient partner, correcting her missteps with quiet good humor rather than impatience, steering her gently through turns she stumbled over more than once. At one point her slipper caught against the hem of her gown and she nearly lost her balance entirely, and he caught her elbow without breaking stride, murmuring something dry about the treachery of borrowed shoes that made her laugh aloud, genuinely, for what felt like the first time in months. "You are better at this than you claim," he said, as the dance drew to its close. "I am better at this than I expected to be," Eleanor admitted, slightly breathless, "though I credit my partner more than my own memory." "I will accept partial credit," Alexander said, "though I suspect you underestimate yourself rather more than you realize, in this, and likely in other matters as well." They did dance again after that, more than once, and for the remainder of the evening Eleanor Whitmore moved through Barrowmere's ballroom, not as an intruder clinging to its edges, but as a guest, seen, spoken to, treated with the ordinary courtesy she had almost forgotten she was owed. She noticed, distantly, Louisa watching from across the room on more than one occasion, her expression unreadable at that distance, and she noticed too that Margaret and her daughters did not attempt to approach again before the evening's end, though she did not fool herself into believing that silence meant the matter had been forgotten. Margaret's patience, when it appeared, was never mercy. It was simply calculation, waiting for a better moment to strike. As the hour grew late and the crowd began to thin, Alexander walked her toward the entrance hall himself, waving away the footman who moved to summon her a hired carriage, and instead calling for his own instead, over her quiet protest that she could not possibly accept such a thing without giving her stepmother further reason for complaint. "Your stepmother will find reason for complaint regardless of how you travel home tonight," Alexander said, not unkindly. "I would rather you arrive safely in a carriage with my crest on the door than risk that road again on foot in the dark. Consider it a small stubbornness on my part, if it eases your conscience to think of it that way." Eleanor did not argue further, too tired, suddenly, from the long, strange wait of the evening to summon the energy for it. As they waited for the carriage to be brought round, standing together beneath the wide stone portico with the last of the music still drifting faintly from the ballroom behind them, Alexander turned to face her fully for the first time since supper. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her, his voice low enough that it would not carry to the footman nearby. "I intend to call on your household properly, as a concerned neighbor if nothing else. I would ask, if you are willing, that you tell me plainly now whether that visit would place you in greater danger than good it might do. I have no wish to make your situation worse through some misguided sense of my own importance." Eleanor considered the question seriously, turning it over with the same careful weighing she applied to every decision inside that house, a habit born of 2 years spent calculating consequences before they arrived rather than after. "I do not think it will make things worse," she said finally. "I think Margaret fears exposure more than almost anything else. A duke's polite, public interest in our household's welfare is not something she can easily dismiss or punish me for privately without drawing exactly the kind of attention she has spent years avoiding." "Then I will call within the week," Alexander said. "And in the meantime, I would ask that you take care. Not everyone who wears a pleasant face at a household gathering intends kindness by it." "I have had 2 years of practice recognizing that particular lesson," Eleanor said, with a small, tired smile that held more truth in it than humor. The carriage arrived a moment later, and Alexander handed her up into it himself, his grip steady and warm against her gloved fingers a moment longer than strict propriety required. "Good night, Eleanor Whitmore," he said. "I do not think tonight is the last strange thing that will happen between our two households, but I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am not sorry for it." "Good night, Alexander," she said, and meant it more than she had meant almost anything, in longer than she could remember. It was well past midnight when Alexander's carriage finally carried her back toward the Whitmore estate, the gilded warmth of the ball fading behind her with every turn of the wheels, replaced, mile by mile, by the familiar cold weight of what waited for her at the end of the road. She did not know what Margaret intended to say when the door opened. She only knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever came next, she would not be facing it quite as alone as she had that morning. The door had not even fully closed behind Eleanor before Margaret's hand struck the small table in the entrance hall hard enough to rattle the candlestick sitting on it. "Do you have any idea," Margaret said, her voice shaking with a fury she had held in check for the entire carriage ride home, "what you have done tonight?" Eleanor stood very still, the warmth of the evening already draining out of her at the familiar sound of that voice, sharp and cold in the empty hall. "I attended a ball, madam. That is all I have done." "You humiliated this family in front of half the county," Margaret snapped, advancing on her. "You stood there and let a duke contradict me publicly. You let him imply, in front of witnesses, that I have mistreated you, and now every drawing room in this county will be whispering about the Whitmore household by morning." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, and something in her, some ember that had caught light during the evening and refused now to be smothered again, kept her voice steady even as her pulse pounded in her throat. "They will only be whispering the truth." The slap came fast and without warning, and Eleanor's cheek burned with it, though she did not step back, did not lower her eyes, only stood there with her mother's borrowed gown still dusted with the road, and looked at Margaret with a steadiness she had never once dared show before tonight. Margaret seemed almost as startled by her own action as Eleanor was, her hand still raised, her breathing ragged. For a long, taut moment, neither of them spoke. "You will not leave this house again," Margaret said finally, lowering her hand, her voice gone cold and flat in a way that frightened Eleanor far more than the shouting had. "Not for balls, not for church, not for anything, until you have learned exactly what your place is in this family. Agnes will be dismissed in the morning. I have no doubt she is the reason you managed tonight's little escape, and every door in this house that can be locked will be." "Agnes did nothing," Eleanor said quickly, fear cutting through her newfound courage. "I found the passage myself, from my father's old letters." Margaret studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to spend further energy on the question tonight. "We will discuss Agnes's fate tomorrow. Go to your room, now." Eleanor went, climbing the stairs with her hand pressed lightly against her stinging cheek, and did not allow herself to cry until she had reached the safety of her own locked door, at which point the tears came anyway, quiet and furious, not for the slap itself but for the crushing return of the wall she had briefly, gloriously, stood outside. The following days passed in a haze of tightened restriction that made her previous confinement look almost generous by comparison. Meals were brought to her room rather than permitted at the family table. The single window she had once used to watch the world pass by was now barred with a length of iron fitted hastily by a local blacksmith, at Margaret's insistence, under the pretense of protecting the household from intruders. Eleanor understood the lie for exactly what it was. Agnes mercifully was not dismissed, though Eleanor suspected this owed less to Margaret believing her story about the letters and more to practical necessity, since dismissing the household's most experienced servant on short notice, without proper reference, would raise exactly the kind of questions Margaret was desperate to avoid in a season already threatening scandal. But Agnes was watched now, her movements around the house monitored more closely, and the two women found themselves unable to exchange more than the briefest, most careful words when duties brought them near one another. It was on the fourth day of this new, harder confinement that Eleanor finally understood the full shape of the trap Margaret had built around her, not through any confession, but through a document she glimpsed by accident, left carelessly on the sitting room desk when Margaret was called away mid-morning to deal with some minor household matter. Eleanor, permitted downstairs only under close supervision to fetch mending supplies, paused at the desk and found herself looking down at her late father's will, or rather a solicitor's summary of its terms she had never once been shown in full during the 2 years since his death. The language was formal and dense, but the substance of it struck her with the force of a physical blow. The Whitmore estate, house and lands and the modest income attached to them, had been left in trust, administered entirely by Margaret as Eleanor's guardian, until such time as Eleanor married with Margaret's consent, or reached the age of 30, whichever came first. Eleanor was 24. 6 more years stood between her and any independent claim to what should, by rights of blood, have already been hers. She understood, reading those cold, careful words, precisely why Margaret had spent 2 years keeping her isolated from society, from suitors, from any opportunity that might lead to marriage on Eleanor's own terms. Every year that passed with Eleanor unmarried and confined was another year Margaret retained full control of an estate that was never truly hers to keep. It was not simply cruelty, Eleanor realized, though cruelty had certainly played its part. It was calculation, cold and patient, dressed up in the language of guardianship and concern. She replaced the document exactly as she had found it and returned to her sewing before Margaret returned to the room, saying nothing, though something inside her had shifted permanently in those few minutes of reading. She was no longer simply enduring an unkind woman's temper, she was fighting, whether she had chosen the fight or not, for something that belonged to her by right, against someone who had every legal and financial incentive to make certain she never claimed it. In the quiet hours of the fourth night, unable to sleep, Eleanor found herself thinking not of the will itself, but of her father, of the man who had raised her to believe she was capable of managing far more than needlework and polite conversation, who had taught her to read accounts and understand the value of land long before he had any reason to suspect he would not live to see her grown and settled. She wondered, staring up at the dark ceiling of her narrow room, whether he had ever imagined the guardianship he arranged in grief and haste might one day become the very cage that held her. She did not believe he had intended cruelty. She believed, rather, that a dying man surrounded by a new wife's careful attentions had simply trusted where trust was not deserved, and that trust had cost his daughter 2 years of her life already, with 4 more looming ahead of her should nothing change. The thought made her angry in a way that surprised her, a clean, useful anger entirely different from the helpless grief she had carried for so long. Grief asked nothing of her but endurance. Anger, she was beginning to understand, asked her to act. She began, in the quiet hours available to her, to take note of small details Margaret had never expected her to notice: which tradesmen called at the house and how often, which ledgers Margaret kept locked in her own writing desk rather than the household strongbox where such things were traditionally stored, which visits from the family solicitor seemed to leave Margaret in unusually good spirits afterward. None of it amounted to proof of anything a court would recognize, but it amounted, Eleanor thought, to a shape, the outline of a pattern she had lived inside for 2 years without ever being permitted to see it clearly. Meanwhile, at Barrowmere, Alexander had not forgotten his promise, though the days following the ball brought him information that troubled him considerably more than he had expected when he first offered to call on the Whitmore household as a simple courtesy. A discreet conversation with his own solicitor, prompted by nothing more than curiosity about the peculiar circumstances he had witnessed at his own ball, uncovered the same broad terms of the elder Whitmore's will that Eleanor herself had only just discovered, along with a detail that troubled Alexander even further. Local tradesmen and household accounts suggested that very little of the estate's income appeared to be spent on its rightful heir at all. "The girl is kept nearly as a prisoner in her own home," Alexander said grimly to his solicitor, a careful, older man named Mr. Aldous, who had served the Barrowmere family for over 20 years, and her stepmother profits from every year that continues. "That is not guardianship. That is theft, dressed in respectable clothing." "It is, unfortunately, entirely legal as it stands, Your Grace," Mr. Aldous said. "Wills of this nature are common enough, meant to protect young women from fortune hunters in their grief. The law does not generally distinguish between a guardian acting in good faith and one acting from self-interest, provided no outright fraud can be proven." "Then we will need to find a path that does not depend on proving fraud," Alexander said, "because I do not intend to simply call at that house, exchange pleasantries over tea, and leave Miss Whitmore exactly as trapped as I found her." Mr. Aldous studied his employer for a long moment, something knowing in his expression. "May I ask, Your Grace, whether your interest in Miss Whitmore's situation is purely a matter of principle, or whether it carries a more personal weight?" Alexander did not answer immediately, turning instead to the window of his study, looking out over the grounds where, only days before, a stranger in a borrowed green gown had stood at the edge of his ballroom looking as though she did not quite believe she was allowed to be there. "I met a great many women during my time abroad, Aldous, and a great many more since returning to take up this title," he said finally. "Most of them wanted something from me before they had spoken a dozen words. Miss Whitmore wanted nothing at all. She did not even want to be noticed, not truly, only to exist for one evening, without fear of what it would cost her. I find I cannot simply walk away from a person who asks for so little and has been given even less." "That," Mr. Aldous said with the faintest hint of a smile, "sounds rather more personal than principle, Your Grace." Alexander did not deny it. He called at the Whitmore estate 5 days after the ball, precisely as he had promised, arriving in his own carriage with proper formal notice sent ahead the previous morning, leaving Margaret no reasonable grounds to refuse him without raising exactly the kind of suspicion she had spent 2 years carefully avoiding. Eleanor, informed only an hour before his arrival that the Duke of Barrowmere requested an audience with the family, felt her heart lift with a hope so sudden and fierce it frightened her, tempered immediately by the cold certainty that Margaret would not surrender any ground without a fight. She was right to be afraid. Margaret spent the hour before his arrival issuing careful instructions to the household, to Louisa and Charlotte, and finally to Eleanor herself, delivered in a low, dangerous voice that left no room for misunderstanding. "You will be pleasant," Margaret said, straightening the collar of Eleanor's plainest dress with hands that gripped rather harder than necessary. "You will say nothing of the will, nothing of the locks, Nothing of anything that has happened in this house since your father died. You will smile, you will thank the Duke for his concern, and you will assure him that all is entirely well. Do you understand me?" Eleanor met her stepmother's eyes and, for the first time in her life, did not immediately look away. "I understand what you are asking of me," she said carefully. "I have not yet decided whether I intend to give it to you." Margaret's grip tightened painfully on her shoulder. "You will give me exactly what I ask, Eleanor, or you will find that whatever small freedoms remain to you vanish entirely, and no Duke's polite visit will change that once his carriage has left these grounds." Louisa and Charlotte were summoned to the sitting room as well, dressed carefully and instructed in turn to speak warmly of Eleanor whenever the opportunity arose, to paint a picture of a happy household bound together by ordinary affection rather than fear. Charlotte, Eleanor noticed, seemed uneasy with the instruction in a way her older sister did not, glancing toward Eleanor once with an expression that might almost have been guilt before quickly looking away when their mother's attention swung in her direction. "Charlotte," Margaret said sharply, catching the look, "you will remember your part as well as your sister does. This family's future depends on the next hour going smoothly, and I will not have either of you jeopardizing it with a careless word." "Yes, Mother," Charlotte murmured, though her eyes flicked briefly toward Eleanor again before she lowered them entirely. Eleanor filed the small moment away with the same careful attention she had begun giving to ledgers and solicitors' visits, wondering, not for the first time, whether Charlotte's quiet discomfort might one day prove useful, or whether it was simply the ordinary unease of a young woman who had never quite possessed her mother's appetite for control. The threat hung in the air between them as the sound of approaching wheels became audible on the gravel drive outside, and Eleanor understood, with painful clarity, that whatever happened in the next hour would determine far more than a single afternoon's comfort. It would determine whether Alexander Barrowmere's promise proved to be the beginning of her freedom, or simply one more thing Margaret found a way to twist into further punishment once he was gone. The knocker sounded twice against the front door, and Eleanor felt every muscle in her body go tight as the housemaid hurried to answer it. Alexander entered the sitting room a moment later, dressed with the same understated formality she remembered from the ball, and Eleanor watched him take in the room in a single unhurried glance. Margaret's carefully arranged smile, Louisa's stiff posture, Charlotte's uneasy silence, and herself, seated slightly apart from the others near the window, in a plain dress that could not have looked more different from the borrowed green silk of 5 nights before. "Your Grace," Margaret said, rising with practiced grace, "what an honor. We were not expecting such distinguished company so soon." "I did send notice," Alexander said pleasantly, though there was something in his tone that suggested he had noted the implied criticism and set it carefully aside for later use. "I hope I have not called at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all," Margaret said. "Please, sit. May I offer you tea?" The conversation that followed moved, for its first quarter hour, along the safe, shallow channels Margaret had clearly planned for it. Weather, the success of the recent ball, polite inquiries about the health of Alexander's estate and tenants. Eleanor said little, aware of Margaret's eyes flicking toward her whenever the conversation drew near anything personal, a silent reminder of the instructions delivered that morning. Alexander, for his part, answered every question with easy courtesy, giving no indication that he had come for any purpose beyond ordinary neighborly interest. It was only when the tea had been poured and the polite formalities sufficiently observed that his tone shifted, subtly but unmistakably, into something more deliberate. "I confess," he said, setting down his cup, "that my visit today is not entirely social. I have been giving some thought, since the ball, to the management of estates left in trust to guardians, a subject that has come up rather often in my own family's history, and I wondered, Mrs. Whitmore, whether you might indulge my curiosity about the particulars of your late husband's arrangements. Purely as one landholder discussing matters with another, you understand." Margaret's smile did not waver, though Eleanor, watching closely, saw the faint tightening at the corners of her eyes. "I am not certain such matters make for pleasant conversation, Your Grace, but I am happy to satisfy your curiosity where I am able. My late husband left the estate in trust under my guardianship, as is common enough in such circumstances, until Eleanor reaches a suitable age or marries with my blessing." "A common enough arrangement, as you say," Alexander agreed. "Though I understand from my own solicitor that such trusts are typically accompanied by regular accounting to the ward, once she reaches a certain age, and by allowances sufficient to maintain her according to the estate's actual income. I ask only because I would hate to think any young woman under such an arrangement might find herself, through no fault of the guardian's intention, somewhat neglected in practice." The room went very still. Louisa's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Charlotte stared fixedly at the pattern of the carpet. "I assure you," Margaret said, her voice noticeably cooler now, "that Eleanor wants for nothing in this household." "I am relieved to hear it," Alexander said smoothly, "though I confess I was troubled, following the ball, to hear Miss Whitmore herself mention certain difficulties, a shortage of available transport, restrictions on her correspondence and company, matters that seemed, to my admittedly outside perspective, somewhat at odds with the comfortable picture you describe." "Eleanor exaggerates," Margaret said quickly, shooting a sharp glance toward her stepdaughter. "She has always had something of a dramatic temperament, particularly since her father's passing. Grief affects young women strangely, Your Grace, and I have done my best to manage her care with patience, though I confess it has not always been easy." Eleanor felt heat rise in her chest at the casual, practiced way Margaret twisted the truth, painting her as unstable in the very breath meant to prove her well cared for. She glanced toward Alexander and found him watching her, not Margaret, as though giving her the choice, silently, of whether to speak now or let the moment pass. She chose to speak. "I do not believe I exaggerated anything," Eleanor said quietly, and though her voice trembled slightly at the start, it steadied as she continued. "I told the Duke that I had not been permitted callers, letters read before I received them, or company beyond this household in 2 years. I do not believe that is dramatic. I believe it is simply true." Margaret's composure cracked visibly for the first time since Alexander's arrival. "Eleanor, this is not the time." "I think," Alexander said, cutting smoothly across her, though his tone remained perfectly courteous, "that this is precisely the time, Mrs. Whitmore, since you have just assured me yourself that Eleanor wants for nothing, and Eleanor has just described circumstances that suggest otherwise. I find myself somewhat at a loss as to which account I ought to believe." "You would take the word of a grieving girl over her own guardian?" Margaret said, her voice sharpening despite her evident effort to hold it level. "I would take the word of anyone," Alexander said, "over a guardian whose household accounts, according to inquiries I have made through entirely proper channels, show remarkably little expenditure on the ward those accounts are meant to support, and remarkably consistent expenditure elsewhere." The silence that followed was absolute. Louisa's face had gone pale. Margaret sat rigid, her teacup trembling faintly in its saucer. "You have been investigating my household," Margaret said finally, low and furious. "I have been asking questions any concerned neighbor might reasonably ask," Alexander said, "and I have found the answers troubling enough that I do not intend to simply leave this matter here. I am prepared to discuss this privately, Mrs. Whitmore, in whatever manner preserves the dignity of your household as much as possible. But I will not pretend I did not come here today with a clear understanding of Eleanor's situation, nor will I leave without some resolution to it." Margaret stood abruptly, her hands pressed flat against her skirts as though physically restraining herself. "This is outrageous. You come into my home, uninvited in spirit if not in letter, and accuse me of mismanaging my own late husband's estate, based on nothing but the word of a girl who has always resented my authority in this house." "I have accused you of nothing yet," Alexander said calmly, remaining seated despite her rising anger, a deliberate steadiness that seemed to unsettle Margaret further than any raised voice could have. "I have only asked questions and observed that the answers do not entirely align. If I am wrong, Mrs. Whitmore, nothing would please me more than for you to prove it, with proper accounts, freely shown, and with Eleanor's own confirmation that her circumstances are as comfortable as you describe." Margaret's eyes moved, briefly, desperately, toward Eleanor, and for one terrible moment Eleanor understood that her stepmother was silently pleading with her, not with words but with 2 years of practiced fear, to simply agree, to smooth this over, to return them both to the familiar, miserable equilibrium that had governed the household since her father's death. Eleanor did not look away this time. "I cannot confirm what is not true," she said quietly. "I am sorry, Margaret. I know this is not what you wanted from this visit, but I will not lie again, not even to keep the peace." Something in Margaret seemed to finally break at those words, not into tears, Eleanor noted, but into something colder and more calculating. The look of a woman recognizing that the ground beneath her had genuinely shifted and old tactics would no longer serve. "What is it you want, Your Grace?" Margaret said, her voice gone flat and businesslike, "since you have clearly come here with more in mind than tea and pleasant conversation." "I want what should have been Eleanor's from the beginning," Alexander said. "Proper accounting of the estate's income and expenditure, delivered to an independent solicitor of my choosing for review. Reasonable freedoms restored to her immediately. Correspondence, company, movement beyond these grounds, the ordinary liberties any woman of her age and standing ought to possess. And I want it understood, clearly, that any further restriction placed upon her will be met with considerably less patience than I have shown today. Margaret's jaw tightened. And if I refuse? Then I will have no choice but to raise the matter formally, through legal channels with the full weight of what I have already learned, Alexander said. And I do not believe, Mrs. Whitmore, that such a proceeding would end favorably for you, whatever the eventual legal outcome, once it became public knowledge in a county that has already begun asking questions since the ball. Reputation, I am told, is a fragile thing. I would rather not be the one to break yours entirely, but I will, if it proves necessary to secure Eleanor's welfare. The threat landed with obvious weight. Margaret's face cycled through fury, calculation, and finally something that resembled grudging surrender, the particular defeat of a woman who understood, at last, that she had run out of moves worth playing. Very well, she said finally, each word clipped and bitter. I will have the accounts prepared. Eleanor may receive callers, within reason. But I will not be lectured further in my own home, Your Grace, whatever your title entitles you to say. I have no wish to lecture you further, Alexander said, rising at last, his tone softening slightly now that the immediate battle had been won, though nothing in his posture suggested he considered the matter fully settled. I only wish to see Eleanor treated with the basic decency any young woman deserves. I trust we understand one another. Margaret said nothing further, only inclined her head stiffly, and Alexander, recognizing the conversation had reached its useful limit, turned to Eleanor with a gentler expression entirely. Miss Whitmore, he said, might I call again in 3 days' time, to discuss the accounting arrangements once my solicitor has reviewed them, with your stepmother's permission, of course. You have it, Margaret said tightly, before Eleanor could answer, clearly eager now to bring the visit to its close, before further damage could be done. Alexander bowed slightly, first to Margaret, then, with noticeably more warmth, to Eleanor, before taking his leave. Eleanor walked him as far as the entrance hall, out of Margaret's immediate hearing, and there he paused, turning to face her fully. I am sorry that had to happen in front of your family, he said quietly. I would have preferred a gentler approach, but I do not think gentleness would have moved your stepmother an inch. You did more in one conversation than I managed in 2 years, Eleanor said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice caught slightly on the words. I do not know how to thank you for this. You do not need to thank me, Alexander said. You only need to hold her to what she has agreed to, and send word to Barrowmere immediately if she does not. I mean that, Eleanor. Immediately. She nodded, and for a moment neither of them moved, the entrance hall quiet around them, the weight of everything unsaid pressing gently against the ordinary formality of a departing guest. 3 days, Eleanor said finally. 3 days, Alexander agreed, and then he was gone, his carriage pulling away down the gravel drive, leaving Eleanor standing alone in a hall that felt, for the first time in 2 years, slightly less like a cage than it had that morning. She did not have long to enjoy the feeling. Margaret's voice called her back into the sitting room within minutes, and Eleanor returned to find her stepmother standing rigid by the window, watching the last dust of the departing carriage settle on the drive, her expression a mask of controlled fury that Eleanor recognized as far more dangerous than the open shouting of 5 nights before. You think this changes anything? Margaret said, without turning around. You think a duke's polite threats over tea will undo 2 years of careful arrangement? I think, Eleanor said carefully, that you agreed to his terms in front of witnesses, and that breaking that agreement now would cost you far more than honoring it. Margaret turned then, and for a long moment simply studied her stepdaughter with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read, something between fury and, unexpectedly, a kind of grudging reassessment, as though she were seeing Eleanor clearly for the first time and longer than either of them cared to admit. You have changed, Margaret said finally. 5 nights ago you would not have dared speak to me the way you did in this room today. 5 nights ago, Eleanor said, I did not yet know what I was fighting for. Now I do. Louisa, who had remained silent through most of the confrontation, spoke up unexpectedly from her seat near the fireplace, her voice unusually subdued. Mother, perhaps it would be simpler to simply comply. The accounts cannot be so difficult to produce, and Eleanor asking for a few more freedoms is hardly. You will not lecture me on simplicity, Louisa, Margaret snapped, rounding on her elder daughter with a sharpness that made Charlotte flinch in her seat nearby. You have benefited as much as I have from the arrangements of this household these past 2 years. Do not pretend otherwise now that a handsome duke has taken an interest in your sister. Louisa's cheeks colored, though whether from embarrassment or genuine shame, Eleanor could not tell, and she said nothing further, retreating instead into the same careful silence Charlotte had maintained throughout the visit. Margaret drew a long breath, visibly forcing her composure back into place, and when she spoke again, her voice had regained its usual cool control, though something brittle remained beneath it. "Very well. I will have the accounts prepared, as promised, and I will not stand in the way of the Duke's visits, since it seems I have little choice in the matter without inviting exactly the scrutiny I have spent 2 years avoiding. But do not mistake this for surrender, Eleanor. I built this household stability with great effort, and I do not intend to watch it dismantled without a fight, simply because a bored aristocrat has taken a passing fancy to a plain girl in a borrowed dress." The insult, delivered with such practiced ease, might once have wounded Eleanor deeply. Standing there now, with Alexander's carriage still faintly audible on the distant road and the memory of his steady voice defending her fresh in her mind, she found instead that the words simply slid past her, losing whatever power they had once held. "Call me plain if it comforts you," Eleanor said quietly. "It changes nothing about what was promised in this room today." She turned and left, before Margaret could summon a response, climbing the stairs to her room with her heart still racing, not from fear this time, but from something closer to triumph, however fragile and provisional it remained. She understood, sitting at her window that evening and watching the barred iron catch the last of the sunset light, that Margaret's surrender was neither complete nor entirely trustworthy. 3 days felt, suddenly, like a very long time to wait, and a very short time to prepare for whatever quiet retaliation Margaret might attempt before Alexander returned. At Barrowmere that same evening, Alexander sat with Mr. Aldous in his study, going over the small details gathered from the afternoon's confrontation. The tightness in Margaret's expression when the accounts were mentioned, the careful, rehearsed quality of her early answers before the conversation slipped beyond her control. "She will delay if she can," Mr. Aldous said, setting down his pen. "Women in her position often do, hoping circumstances shift in their favor before any true reckoning arrives." "Then we will not give her the luxury of time," Alexander said. "Send word to the solicitor she names, whoever it may be, that I expect the accounts within the week, not the vague promise of eventual compliance. And Aldous, I want you to look further into the household's finances yourself, quietly, in the meantime. I do not trust that woman to hand over an honest record without considerable persuasion." "You seem rather invested in this matter, Your Grace," Mr. Aldous observed. "Not for the first time. For a household you had no acquaintance with a fortnight ago." Alexander considered the fire crackling in the grate for a long moment before answering. "I watched a woman stand in her own sitting room today and choose truth over safety, knowing full well what it might cost her afterward. I do not think I have watched anyone do that, Aldous, not truly. Not since I was young enough to still believe most people would choose the same. I find I am not willing to let that particular courage go unrewarded, whatever shape the reward eventually takes." Mr. Aldous said nothing further on the matter that evening, though the faint, knowing smile that crossed his face as he gathered his papers suggested he understood, better than his employer perhaps intended to admit aloud, exactly what shape that reward was already beginning to take. The accounts arrived at Barrowmere 4 days later, not the week Alexander had allowed, delivered by a nervous local solicitor named Mr. Enfield, who had clearly been given very little choice in the timing, by whichever party had pressed hardest for haste. Alexander received the ledgers in his study and spent the better part of an afternoon working through them alongside Mr. Aldous, and what they found confirmed every suspicion the visit to the Whitmore household had raised. The discrepancies were not subtle, once properly examined. Years of household expenditure recorded under vague headings that Mr. Aldous, with decades of experience reading exactly this kind of deliberate obscurity, recognized immediately for what it was: funds diverted toward Louisa and Charlotte's wardrobes and social engagements, far beyond what any reasonable guardian would consider necessary, while entries directly concerning Eleanor's own maintenance grew thinner and thinner with each passing year, until the most recent accounts showed almost nothing allocated to her at all beyond the barest necessities of food and basic clothing. "This is not simply neglect," Mr. Aldous said grimly, turning the pages. "This is a woman who has been systematically redirecting a ward's inheritance toward her own daughters for 2 years, confident that no one would ever look closely enough to notice." "Then someone will look closely enough now," Alexander said. He called on the Whitmore household the following morning, earlier than the previously arranged 3 days, arriving with Mr. Aldous at his side and the reviewed accounts, annotated in the solicitor's careful hand, tucked beneath his arm. Margaret received them in the same sitting room as before, though her composure this time seemed thinner, more brittle, the composure of a woman who understood, perhaps, that whatever ground she had hoped to hold was already slipping. "Your Grace," she said, rising with noticeably less confidence than her earlier greeting had carried. "I did not expect you until tomorrow." "I found I could not wait," Alexander said, taking the seat offered without further pleasantry. "Mrs. Whitmore, my solicitor has reviewed the accounts you provided, and I am afraid we have found certain irregularities that require immediate explanation." He gestured to Mr. Aldous, who laid the annotated pages on the table between them with the quiet efficiency of a man who had delivered difficult news to difficult people many times before, and proceeded to walk through the discrepancies one by one: the pattern of diverted funds, the years of near-total neglect toward Eleanor's own maintenance, the careful language used throughout to disguise what amounted, in plain terms, to years of quiet theft from a ward too isolated to notice or object. Margaret's face grew paler with every passing minute, though she attempted, initially, the same practiced deflections she had relied upon before: misunderstandings of household expense, the natural costs of raising 3 young women rather than 1, the impossibility of perfectly equal division given the girls' differing needs. But Mr. Aldous had built his case too carefully for such vague explanations to hold, and eventually Margaret's protests grew quieter, her responses shorter, until she sat in silence, staring at the pages before her as though willing them to rearrange themselves into something less damning. "I do not believe," Alexander said finally, once the accounting had been thoroughly laid out, "that this matter can be resolved with a simple promise of improved behavior going forward, Mrs. Whitmore. What I have seen here suggests a pattern too deliberate, too sustained, to be dismissed as an oversight." "What is it you intend to do then?" Margaret said, her voice gone quiet and flat, the fight drained out of it. "Ruin me publicly? Drag my daughter's names through scandal alongside mine?" Eleanor, who had been sitting silently through the entire exchange, felt something twist in her chest at those words, an unexpected pull of sympathy she had not anticipated. Even now, even after everything, whatever Margaret had done, Louisa and Charlotte had done nothing beyond existing as the daughters of a woman who used them, in her own way, as thoroughly as she had used Eleanor. "I do not wish to ruin anyone," Eleanor said quietly, drawing every eye in the room toward her. "Alexander, might I speak?" He nodded immediately, deferring to her without hesitation, and Eleanor turned to face her stepmother directly, choosing her words with the same careful weight she had learned to give every decision inside these walls. "I do not want scandal, Margaret," Eleanor said. "I do not want you dragged before magistrates, or Louisa and Charlotte's prospects ruined by association with whatever judgment falls on you. I want only what should have been mine from the beginning: control of my own inheritance, freedom to live my own life, and an end to being treated as a burden in my own father's house. If you can give me that, quietly, without further fighting, I see no reason this needs to become the kind of public spectacle that harms everyone in this room, including people who have done nothing to deserve it." Margaret stared at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes: surprise, perhaps, or the first honest reckoning with a stepdaughter she had spent 2 years underestimating. "You would simply let me keep my position, my daughter's futures intact, after everything," Margaret said, disbelief evident in her voice. "I would let you keep your dignity," Eleanor said, "provided you finally, truly, relinquish the guardianship of my estate, restore what can be reasonably restored, and never again pretend that caring for me and controlling me were ever the same thing." The room fell silent. Mr. Aldous glanced toward Alexander, a silent question in his expression, and Alexander gave the smallest nod, deferring the moment entirely to Eleanor, whose fight this had always truly been. Margaret's shoulders sagged, the last of her careful composure finally giving way entirely, not into tears, but into something quieter, more exhausted, the visible collapse of a woman who had spent years maintaining a structure she now understood could not stand much longer under honest scrutiny. "Very well," Margaret said finally. "The guardianship will be relinquished, formally, through whatever legal process your solicitor requires. I will not fight it further." Mr. Aldous moved quickly to draw up the necessary documents, and within the hour, with Margaret's signature and a local magistrate summoned to witness the proceedings, the guardianship that had bound Eleanor for 2 years was formally dissolved. The estate's control returned entirely to her own name. The barred window and locked doors rendered, at last, nothing more than physical objects she now had every legal right to remove. Louisa, watching the proceedings from the doorway where she had drifted during the final discussion, approached Eleanor once the documents were signed, her expression uncertain in a way Eleanor had rarely seen from her. "I did not know," Louisa said quietly, "not the full extent of it. I knew you were kept close, but I did not know about the accounts, the money meant for your care. I want you to believe that, even if you have no reason to." Eleanor studied her stepsister for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of the words against 2 years of small cruelties she could not simply forget on command. "I believe you did not ask," Eleanor said finally, "which is not quite the same as not knowing, but I do not intend to carry this anger forward into whatever comes next, Louisa. I have spent enough of my life carrying things that were never mine to bear." It was not quite forgiveness, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of something workable between them, and Louisa seemed to understand that, nodding once before stepping back to allow Eleanor the space she clearly needed. Charlotte said nothing at all, only crossed the room and embraced Eleanor briefly, awkwardly, before retreating again, and Eleanor found the small, wordless gesture carried more honesty than anything Louisa had managed to say aloud. Agnes, who had watched the entire proceeding from the hallway with her hands twisted tightly in her apron, could no longer contain herself once the magistrate departed, hurrying into the sitting room to embrace Eleanor with a fierceness that startled them both. "I told your mother I would not let you disappear into these walls," Agnes said, her voice thick with tears she made no attempt to hide, "and I confess, there were nights these past 2 years when I feared I had failed her entirely. I am glad, Miss Eleanor, more glad than I have words for, to have been wrong." "You were never close to failing her," Eleanor said, holding the older woman tightly. "You gave me the one thing I needed most, a door that would open when I finally found the courage to walk through it. I do not think I could have found that courage alone." "Nonsense," Agnes said, pulling back to look at her properly. "The courage was always yours. I only handed you a key that was already meant to be found." Eleanor did not entirely believe that distinction. Not that evening, standing in a house so recently transformed from prison to simply a home again. But she let the moment settle without argument, grateful beyond measure for a woman who had risked everything on nothing more than a promise made to a dying friend years before. The following weeks passed in a blur of quiet transformation. Eleanor moved through her father's house with a freedom she had almost forgotten was possible, the barred window removed within days, her correspondence her own again, her choices, for the first time in 2 years, entirely her own to make. Alexander called often, though never so often as to raise fresh gossip, his visits marked by the same easy, direct conversation that had first drawn her to him at the ball, walks through the estate gardens, long discussions of books and household management, and the small, ordinary things two people learn about each other when courtship is built on honesty rather than performance. She learned over those weeks that his reserve at the ball had not been born of arrogance, but of a genuine weariness, with a society that valued his title far more than his character, that he had spent his years abroad, partly in search of exactly the kind of plain, unguarded conversation he had stumbled into with her that first night. He learned, in turn, that her quietness was not timidity but the disciplined stillness of someone who had trained herself, out of necessity, to give nothing away that could later be used against her, a habit that softened, slowly, week by week, as she came to trust that nothing shared with him would ever be turned into a weapon. They spoke, too, of practical matters, the estate she now controlled outright, decisions about tenants and repairs, and the small inherited responsibilities her father had once managed with quiet competence. Alexander never once tried to take those decisions from her hands, offering counsel only when asked, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since her father's death, genuinely enjoying the weight of responsibility rather than fearing it, because it was, at last, entirely her own to carry or share as she chose. Agnes was given a permanent place in the Whitmore household regardless of whatever came next, a formal position and a wage that finally matched the years of loyalty she had given so freely, and Eleanor made certain, before any wedding plans progressed further, that this small piece of justice was settled first, a debt she considered far more urgent than any guest list or gown fitting. It was in the garden, several weeks after the accounts had been settled, beneath the same kind of late afternoon light that had first drawn Eleanor to her window as a girl imagining a life beyond locked doors, that Alexander finally asked the question both of them had been circling for weeks without quite naming it. "Eleanor," he said, stopping beside the old stone bench where her mother had once liked to sit, "I have spent a great deal of time these past weeks telling myself that I was simply being a concerned neighbor, a responsible landholder correcting an injustice nearby. I do not think either of us truly believes that anymore." Eleanor felt her heart quicken, though she said nothing, waiting. "I would like to ask you to marry me," Alexander said, "not because you need rescuing, you have made it entirely clear these past weeks that you require rescuing from no one, but because I have not once, in all my years, met a person whose company I valued more than my own solitude, until the night you stood at the edge of my ballroom in a borrowed gown, and told me, quite plainly, that you did not care much for pleasant nonsense either." Eleanor laughed, unexpectedly, the sound bright and full in the quiet garden. That is a very strange thing to propose marriage over. It is the truest thing I know about you, Alexander said, and I have found, in my experience, that truth makes for a considerably sturdier foundation than pleasant nonsense ever could. Then yes, Eleanor said, before he had even finished the thought fully, surprising herself with how easily the answer came. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. He took her hand then, and Eleanor felt, standing in the garden where her mother had once sat, in the house that had held her prisoner for 2 long years, the last of that old fear finally loosen its grip entirely. She was not being rescued, she understood. Not truly, not in the way stories sometimes told it. She had fought her own way free, inch by careful inch, and Alexander had simply refused to let her fight entirely alone. The wedding, when it came that autumn, was neither large nor small, attended by those who had genuinely earned a place in Eleanor's life, rather than those who merely wished to be seen attending a duke's wedding. Agnes stood near the front, weeping openly with pride, and even Louisa and Charlotte attended, their presence, whatever complicated history remained between them, a small acknowledgement of the family Eleanor had chosen to preserve rather than burn entirely to the ground. Margaret did not attend. She had retreated, in the months following the guardianship's dissolution, to a smaller property left to her separately by her own family, and though Eleanor felt no particular warmth toward her, she felt, standing at the altar beside Alexander, no bitterness either, only the quiet, settled peace of a woman who had finally, fully, stepped out from behind a locked door, and did not intend, ever again, to let anyone hand her the key. The ceremony itself was simple, held in the small stone chapel at Barrowmere rather than the grand cathedral in the city that Alexander's rank might have suggested, a choice Eleanor had made deliberately, and one he had agreed to without a moment's hesitation. She wore, at her own quiet insistence, a gown of pale gold silk rather than anything borrowed, the first dress she had ever chosen entirely for herself, cut and stitched to her own measurements rather than altered from someone else's shoulders. Standing at the altar, watching Alexander's steady gray eyes meet hers as the vicar spoke the familiar words, Eleanor found her thoughts drifting, briefly, to the girl who had stood locked behind her own bedroom door not so many months before, listening to a carriage roll away without her. She wished, in that fleeting moment, that she could somehow reach back and tell that frightened, furious young woman that the door would open eventually, that the key had been closer than she knew, and that courage, however small it felt in the moment of using it, was rarely wasted. After the vows were spoken and the small gathered crowd had offered their congratulations, Eleanor and Alexander walked together through the gardens where he had first proposed, the autumn light turning everything gold and warm around them, and for the first time in longer than she could properly measure, Eleanor Whitmore, now Eleanor Barrowmere, felt entirely, wholly free. Snow had already begun falling over Barrowmere by the time Eleanor received the letter, and she read it twice at the breakfast table before setting it down beside her cup, her expression unreadable enough that Alexander lowered his own newspaper to study her more closely. "Bad news?" he asked. "I am not entirely certain yet," Eleanor said. "It is from Charlotte." She had not heard from Charlotte in nearly a year, not since the wedding, though occasional word had reached her through Louisa, who had settled into a quiet, comfortable marriage of her own the previous spring, to a country solicitor with a gentle temperament that seemed, by all accounts, to suit her far better than the ambitious matches Margaret had once dreamed of arranging. Charlotte, younger and less settled, had remained with Margaret at the smaller property, and Eleanor had often wondered, in idle moments, what life looked like for her stepsister under their mother's continued, if considerably diminished, influence. The letter, when Eleanor finally read it aloud to Alexander over the remainder of breakfast, described a household grown smaller and quieter, Margaret's health beginning to fail under the weight of years and diminished circumstances, and Charlotte herself increasingly restless, aware that whatever future waited for her would not be found within those narrowing walls. She wrote carefully, almost apologetically, asking whether Eleanor might have any advice, any connections, anything at all that might help a young woman find her own way forward without waiting for a marriage that seemed, in that quiet household, increasingly unlikely to arrive on its own. "She is asking for help," Alexander said when Eleanor finished reading, "though it costs her a great deal of pride to ask it, if I am any judge of the tone." "She is," Eleanor agreed, setting the letter down again, turning it over in her mind. "I did not expect to feel anything at all reading this. I expected, if I am honest, a certain grim satisfaction, watching that household finally reap what it sowed. Instead, I find myself only wanting to help her, which I confess I do not entirely understand in myself." Perhaps, Alexander said gently, it is simply because you remember, better than most people ever could, exactly what it feels like to stand at the edge of a life you cannot yet see a way into. Charlotte was never the architect of your suffering, whatever her silence may have cost you. Perhaps some part of you has always known that. Eleanor considered this for a long moment, the snow continuing to fall softly beyond the tall windows of the breakfast room, and found, turning the thought over carefully, that he was likely right. Whatever bitterness she had once carried toward the Whitmore household had faded, over the past year, into something quieter and more settled. Not forgiveness exactly, not for Margaret, but something adjacent to it where Charlotte was concerned. A recognition that a frightened, overlooked younger daughter and a locked-away stepdaughter had perhaps understood each other, in their own separate silences, better than either had realized at the time. She wrote back within the week, offering Charlotte a place at Barrowmere for the winter season, an opportunity to meet people beyond the narrow circle Margaret had always kept her within, and, if Charlotte wished it, assistance in securing a position as a governess or companion, should marriage prove not to be the path she wanted after all. The invitation was extended without conditions, without any expectation of gratitude or apology for the past, only the simple offer of a door left open for someone who had once, in her own small and frightened way, tried to signal discomfort with a household built on control. Charlotte arrived at Barrowmere 3 weeks later, thinner than Eleanor remembered and considerably quieter, but with an eagerness in her eyes that reminded Eleanor sharply of her own first uncertain steps into that gilded ballroom, months before. The two young women spent that winter slowly rebuilding something that had never quite existed between them before. Not sisterhood exactly, the years and history between them too complicated for so simple a word, but a genuine friendship built on honesty rather than the careful performances Margaret had once demanded of them both. It was during that same winter that Eleanor finally received word of Agnes's long-delayed happiness as well. A quiet wedding of her own to a widowed tenant farmer on the Barrowmere estate whom Eleanor had, with some quiet amusement, noticed lingering rather longer than strictly necessary during his visits to discuss matters of the harvest. Eleanor attended the small ceremony herself, standing at the back of the modest village chapel and feeling, watching Agnes married at last to a kind, steady man who clearly adored her, that some final piece of the debt she owed the older woman had been repaid, not in money or position, though both had been offered and accepted, but in simply being present, to witness a happiness so long delayed. Margaret's health continued to decline through that winter, and though Eleanor did not visit her directly, unwilling to reopen wounds that had only just begun to properly heal, she ensured, quietly and without fanfare, that a physician's care and basic comfort were provided for the woman who had once locked her behind her own bedroom door. It was not an act of love, Eleanor understood clearly in her own mind, but neither was it cruelty repaid for cruelty. It was, simply, the kind of person she had decided to become, once she was finally free to decide anything about herself at all, someone who met old wounds with quiet dignity, rather than matching bitterness for bitterness. Louisa, too, wrote occasionally that winter, her letters carrying a warmth that had grown steadily since her own marriage, as though the freedom of building a household of her own had softened whatever hard edges Margaret's constant pressure had once carved into her. She wrote of small domestic matters mostly, her husband's modest but steady practice, the garden she was slowly learning to tend, and once, in a letter that surprised Eleanor more than any other, a quiet apology for the years she had spent complicit in her mother's arrangements, not excusing them, only acknowledging, plainly, that she understood now how much easier it had been to look away than to ask difficult questions. Eleanor answered that letter carefully, choosing honesty over easy comfort, telling Louisa that she appreciated the acknowledgement without pretending it erased the years it addressed, and that she hoped they might, in time, build something new between them that did not depend on either forgetting the past or being endlessly defined by it. Louisa's reply, shorter than usual, contained only a single line that Eleanor found herself returning to more than once that winter. "Thank you for not asking me to pretend it never happened." By spring, Charlotte had settled into a position as companion to an elderly aunt of Alexander's living in the neighboring county, a position that suited her temperament far better than the marriage market Margaret had once pressed upon her, and she wrote to Eleanor often, her letters growing warmer and more genuine with each passing month, filled with small, ordinary observations about her new life that spoke, more than any direct statement could, of a young woman finally permitted to simply exist as herself. Eleanor, for her part, found her own life at Barrowmere settling into a rhythm she had once believed impossible for herself, mornings spent managing the correspondence and small decisions of her own restored estate, which she had chosen, deliberately, to keep under her own direct oversight, rather than fold entirely into Alexander's holdings. Afternoons spent in the gardens or the vast library that had so intrigued her that first night, evenings spent in conversation with a husband who had never once, in all their months together, asked her to be smaller or quieter or more convenient than she naturally was. On a warm afternoon in early summer, nearly a year to the day since the ball that had changed everything, Eleanor stood once more at the edge of the Barrowmere ballroom, watching preparations for that season's gathering unfold around her. Garlands being hung, chairs arranged, the same tall windows that had once seemed so impossibly grand, now simply a familiar, beloved part of her daily life. Alexander found her there, watching the preparations with a faint, private smile. "You are remembering the first time you stood in that doorway," he said, not a question. "I am," Eleanor admitted. "I was so certain that night that I did not belong here, that someone would notice the dust on my hem and send me back to a house that had already stopped feeling like home." "And now?" Alexander asked, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a year spent learning every quiet gesture the other preferred. "Now," Eleanor said, looking out over the room that had once seemed like the most impossible place in the world for a girl like her, and was now, simply, hers. "I do not think I have ever belonged anywhere quite so completely." Outside, the summer light stretched long and gold across the gardens, touching the same stone bench where he had once asked her to marry him, the same gravel drive she had once walked in borrowed slippers with nothing but a stolen key and a mother's old gown to carry her forward. Later that evening, as the first guests began arriving in carriages that lined the drive just as they had a year before, Eleanor found herself once again near the entrance of the ballroom, though this time as its hostess rather than an uninvited stranger. She greeted arrivals with an ease that would have seemed impossible to the frightened young woman who had once stood at this same threshold with dust on her hem and nothing but borrowed courage to carry her forward, and she found, watching new guests pause at the doorway with the same wide, uncertain eyes she herself had once worn, that she made a point of crossing the room to speak with anyone who looked as though they did not quite believe they belonged. She thought often, in quiet moments over the following months, of Agnes's words that first strange night, that the courage had always been hers, that the key had only ever needed finding rather than giving. She thought too of her father, and hoped, in whatever quiet way the dead might know such things, that he understood she had finally claimed the life he had always intended for her, however long and difficult the path toward it had proven to be. She thought, standing there in the quiet golden hour before the evening's guests arrived, of every locked door she had ever stood behind, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep and permanent in her chest, that she would never again need anyone else to hand her the key. She had found, at last, that the courage to open doors herself had been hers all along, waiting only for the moment she finally trusted herself enough to use it.